Imagine South Africa in 2030. How far is the country likely to be in terms of land reform? Well, Vumelana Advisory Fund has created 4 different scenarios on what could happen. We're now joined by the company's Brian Whittaker, who wrote a very interesting article. And I like the way you titled it, Brian. Welcome, first of all. It's time we had a courageous conversation. Do we know how to go about this conversation?
Well, that's why we started these scenarios, because it's very difficult to start courageous conversations in all sorts of ways, for individuals, organizations, and for society. And we thought that if we could prepare scenarios that are just stories that would help people into the conversation. So Vumelana main business is about helping communities who win their rights under the land reform program to use that land effectively by forging partnerships. But we realized when we were doing that, there's a lot of uncertainty about where all of this is heading. So what we did is we got together a group of 40 people from a widely diverse range: public officials, private companies, activists, religious leaders, community leaders, traditional leaders. And we said to them, why don't we just for a while stop trying to persuade one another that we're right? Let me stop trying to persuade you to adopt my point of view, and you stop trying to, and just ask one another what could happen. And that's how we started the conversation with them. So the scenarios are not proposals for what should happen, and they're not predictions about what will happen. They're just stories about what could happen. And by telling these stories, it's possible to get people to start having the courageous conversations which otherwise they might not get into.
So I'm going to sit back for a moment, because I'm interested to hear the contents of these 4 scenarios that you've come up with. Just talk us briefly through each one of them, please.
So if people are interested in this, they can go and look at it on landreformfutures.org. They can see the detail there. But very briefly, the 4 stories were like this. There's one story which is about capture. In this story, land reform is captured by those who have particular political connections. So the way the story plays out, and remember these are just stories, the way the story plays out, the ruling party gets into difficulty. It's wondering about how it's going to hang on to power in 2019. It begins to look around for allies. Included in the allies they begin to think about are traditional leaders, and eventually in this story a deal is done where traditional leaders mobilize some votes and the political parties are enabled to win the right to win the day in the elections, and the traditional leaders get control of the land. So there's an example of a story that's not a comfortable story for many people, but you say this is just a story. But the interesting thing here is that this 40 very widely diverse group of 40 people think that's one of the possible stories, but it's just one.
I want to quickly ask you, before you move on to the second one, the consequences of that scenario. So
the consequences of that scenario are that people with political connections win and everyone else loses.
So take me through 2, 3, and 4, including the consequences.
So the second scenario is about confiscation. This is a scenario where ordinary people get tired of waiting. They begin to occupy land. They just take over things. These are stories we hear about in the press quite frequently. Eventually, the ruling party gets to the point where they're very worried about being able to control this, and they decide that if they can't beat them, they should join them. And so the constitution is changed, which allows people who've confiscated land to hold on to it. The end of that scenario is really rather an unhappy one. Even the people who've confiscated the land find it difficult to work the land. They can't raise investment. Investors begin to peel off from the country. They don't invest in other parts of the economy, and things gradually begin to decline. That's the confiscation story. The third story is about concentration. In this story, the racial complexion of people who own land changes, but the concentration of power in the hands of a few remains. So there's this shift, the targets are met, but actually ordinary people are not benefiting sufficiently. And the end of that scenario is ordinary people end up feeling shortchanged. They think to themselves, this is not how this should have turned out, and they become angry. The fourth scenario we called compromise. This is a scenario in which everyone begins to realize that you can't get everything you want. If I want what I want and I just try and grab it or hold on to it, I'm going to lose it. What I have to do is talk to other people, work with other people, and strike compromises that are fair and practical. And in this scenario, the government begins to draw many more people into the process than has been the case before. They create the conditions in which the conversations can take place. Serious compromises are made, and people begin to move forward slowly. So none of these scenarios are very easy. It's all hard work. But we did begin to see how if you follow one route, you're likely to end up in one place and another route in another. The interesting thing that I've discovered in going around and telling people about these scenarios, people say to me, well, you're supposed to be telling us what will happen in 2030, but actually we can see all four of these happening now. And that's very true. If you stop and think about this, we can see cases where political interest groups are capturing things. We can see cases where people are beginning to talk about and in fact confiscating. Excuse me, there are cases where agreements are being made that change the racial profile but actually don't spread benefits very far. And encouragingly, there are many more cases than people realize of people actually doing the hard bargaining and compromising. So we're sort of heading down this road. The question is, which fork are we going to take as we head towards 2030?
Well, clearly, even a child listening to this story would veer towards the compromise scenario because it seems to be the most reasonable and will likely have the most benefits for the country. How do we steer the country in that direction?
If only we all had the wisdom of children. So there are some people who think they can do the deals because they have the political connections, or because they have the economic power, or because they've got the people power. So, you know, it does sound rationally that compromise is what we should do, but there are various vested interests who have interests in pursuing the other scenarios. But how do we get to the point where we can begin to move down a compromise route? We think the first step is to have the conversation. What these scenarios try to do is put some of these issues on the table in a non-threatening way. Remember, we're not saying these are proposals or predictions. We're just saying these are stories. Do you believe them? The group here of 40 people, just to remind you, included some of the most senior people in government, private sector people who own land, community leaders and so on. They all concluded that actually that group of 40 people think these four scenarios could play out. In 2030, we could end up in any one of these four places. In order to make sure we begin to steer things in the direction that will give the most benefit for the most people, we have to start the conversation. I think at the moment, far too many people feel that they are excluded from and in a sense victims of this process. They want to be part of it, and we have to create ways to help them to do that.
Brian, thank you so much for coming in to talk to us. Such a lot of food for thought there. It was Brian Whittaker from the Vumelana Advisory Fund.